I do want to get into a little other cool stuff I think that'll be super helpful in your journey with front-end GraphQL and stuff like that. So one thing to note here is a really cool feature called aliasing using queries and mutations. So if you have fields, like in this case, you have a field called name. What else do we have here on a character? We have name, status, species, type, gender, origin, image, episode, all this stuff. So if I wanted to, for instance, we get a name here, but let's say in the component of my UI, I'm not looking for a character.name. I'm looking for a character.full name, something like that. It's not name, and I don't want to go change it in my component. So I just want to change it from GraphQL so I can stick it straight in my component. But I also don't have access to the server to go change the whole API, or maybe something else is using name, and if I change it on the API level, it's going to break everything else. So I don't want to change the name, but I also don't want to change it in my React app. So what do? This is where aliases come in. So with an alias, I can just put whatever I want to the left of it like that, and now I can alias name with whatever I want it to be. In this case, full name. So if I were to do that, it changes to full name. This is really cool. One of the big things I like to do with aliases is, if you notice, when whatever query or mutation you run, the name of it, that's what you get back in the response. So you'll get data dot whatever the query name is. Sometimes I don't like that, and this case is redundant because there's already results here. But sometimes I'll do something like results, and I'll actually alias the query, and I'll make sure like all my queries have like data.results or something like that, versus data dot whatever the name of the query is and having to figure it out every time and going back. I just always alias it to a standard name that I always use for every single query, and I can look for it that way. So that's one thing to note. But yeah, you can alias any field that you want. Another good example of doing aliases is if you have like conflicting fields from union types or from interfaces, you can do aliases to change whatever those field values are and stuff like that. That way you don't have that collision there. So it's really another good example of that. The other thing is you can run multiple queries in one API call. So if I wanted to run another query simultaneously within the same operation, even the exact same query, like I could just do this. I could just copy this and run this again. If I try to execute this with both queries happening simultaneously, GraphQL can support that. But when I execute them right now, it actually won't run two, and that's because they're both the same name. So by default, this is going to get deduplicated. It's going to realize like, oh, you're actually already running a query with the exact same name. So I'm just only going to run them once. I'm going to deduplicate it for you. So in order to get this to run, I would have to alias this to something else. And then when I execute this, you can see I get something else down here. So that's another good example of using aliases on field levels, is to help you resolve the point where you have like multiple queries running at one time. And on the server side, this is all going to happen pretty much in parallel. So this is you adding multiple queries to one operation, but at the same time, depending on what framework you're using, you might be running multiple operations at one time that all get batched as well. So if you think about it, let's say you loaded up your app started up, it had an operation that ran for the nav bar to get the user, had an operation for whatever page you're looking on to get the main data, and another operation that did something else. And each one of those operations had 10 queries inside of them for some reason. That's 30 queries your server is going to be executing at pretty much one time. So something to think about there. But as a front-end person working on this, you don't care. I guess, it doesn't really matter. But just something to think about when you're executing your queries and putting them together. There's a lot of other cool stuff that we'll get to with queries and mutations and things like that. But for now, yeah, this is it. And then I guess on the flip side of this, I've been talking about queries. For mutations, if you want to do a mutation operation, it's very similar to a query operation. You just use the mutation keyword, and then you also just do, I don't think this API has any mutations, which is why I can actually execute. Yeah, there's no mutations on this API, but you can just do mutation, followed by whatever operation you want. Let's say I was creating a character, and I wanted some variables there, and if there was a mutation, I would use that one here, create character. And it's the same thing. It follows the same rules as the query. So the only difference here is you use the mutation keyword to the left versus the query keyword. That's it. Nothing else changes. Exact same thing. Same variable rules, same all that stuff. It's all good to go. Yes?
So what's the point of naming mutations? Will those be cached as well?
That's a good question. Will mutations be cached as well? No. Mutations themselves aren't cached because they're not really cached, but the operations are still going to be indexed, so you can reference them through tools, and you'll see another tool that we're going to download for React that it's very important to name these. But as far as like the data being cached, no, they're not going to be cached for you like a query would, at least not with the library that we're using. Some libraries might do it, but no. The reason I think it's important to also just put these names on them is because you don't really understand, unless you built it, what the tools you're using are going to be doing with them. So in that case, I tend to just always add operation names when I'm doing client-side implementations because I have no idea what this library that I downloaded is expecting, what it's doing with these names, if it's planning on indexing them, if it's trying to cache them, if it's doing something smart that I'm not aware of. Always just provide the name for it. But no, you're not going to have cache mutations. Only query results are going to be cached. And we'll get to the point where how do you update a cache after you mutate something? Because you will have to do that. So we'll talk about that.
What's sent across the wire? Just a string posted?
Good question. So there's a lot of ways that this could happen. If it's a GET request, then this is going to be a query string on the end with I think the parameter is literally called, or the query is actually called query equals, and it's literally your query stringified up to the maximum character of whatever query string can be. Same thing with mutations. Mutations can also be on the GET request, and that happens too. But most of the time, it's going to be a post request. And on a post request, I believe it's going to be a body that has query in it, and it's going to be your query as a string. And if there's variables, there's going to be a field called variables, and that's going to be your variables object. And that's basically what gets sent up. But yeah, most of the time it's going to be a post request, unless you're doing something like persistent query or something like that, where you just do a GET request with the URL and you're good to go.
Is there any support for like something in this one, if you have a list of characters and they have a list of episodes, rather than returning all the episodes in the field on there, like just returning like the number of episodes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a couple ways you can support that. The easy way, or the obvious way, is whoever made the API needs to support a field that says, episode count. That's one. The other thing you could do, and all of these are going to require someone on the back end doing something. The other thing you can do is have a directive that, and we haven't talked too much about directives or directives at all, but basically you could have a directive that might say, I don't know, it might have something here called count or something like that. It could do anything. A directive can literally do anything that allows you to get that. I know there are some really cool ones, Lodash, GraphQL. Let me see if this is still a thing. So this directive library is something you can add to GraphQL that allows you to basically use Lodash inside of a query, which is really cool. So something like this might be able to offer you that flexibility without having to ask the person working on the server to change something. But yeah, most of the time it's going to require a backend change.